Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 310 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Joe Fisher's spirit guides. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In 1984, author Joe Fisher came into contact with an unusual woman. A leukemia patient, she had turned to hypnosis to help with health and pain management. While under hypnosis, she began to receive messages from spiritual guides. Soon, Joe Fisher was part of a group that was regularly attending her sessions, and Joe got to know his own guide, a woman named Philippa, with whom he had shared an incarnation in 18th century Greece. But Joe was a paranormal author and investigator, and the guides encouraged his ambitious plan to travel internationally and verify that the guides had really lived as the historical individuals they claimed to be, so that he could validate their important messages. So what happened when Joe Fisher went to check out their claims? What evidence did he discover? And what did he eventually conclude? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, what do we need to say to begin today's mystery?
Well, this is a very compelling story, and there's a lot to say about it. It has quite a number of twists and turns in it, so this is going to be the first part of a two-parter. Today, we'll start telling you what happened, and then next week we'll tell you how it ended, what Joe Fisher concluded about his experiences, and what I'd make of it from the faith and reason perspectives.
So, Jimmy, who is Joe Fisher?
He was a British author who was born in 1947. Here's some information about him from a piece by author Lauren Coleman.
Joe Fisher was an investigative writer specializing in metaphysical topics. His books had sold more than 1 million copies in 22 languages. Andrew Joseph Fisher was born and educated in England. He held dual citizenship with Canada, his home base since 1971. He regularly gave workshops and seminars based on his explorations into the supernatural. A veteran broadcaster who gave more than 200 radio and television interviews on his work, Fisher started his career as a junior reporter on the Staffordshire Advertiser, where he became, at 22 years of age, the youngest news editor in England. After emigrating to Canada, he worked as an investigative reporter and feature writer for both the Toronto Sun and the Toronto Star. His journalistic stints were interspersed with excursions to Greece, Ireland, Ecuador, Morocco, and Peru, where he pursued personal writing projects. At Ecuador's Colegio Americano in Quito, he taught English and composed journals which were later edited for the book Cotopaxi Visions, Travels in Ecuador. In 1981, Joe Fisher left daily journalism to concentrate on writing books and freelance articles. Since then, he has traveled widely. Australia and Antarctica are recent destinations, and contributed to periodicals ranging from Canada's national dailies, the National Post and the Globe and Mail, to magazines including Outpost, Equinox, Ocean Drive, and Life and Soul. Joe Fisher's books included the contemporary metaphysical classics The Siren Call of Hungry Ghosts, Life Between Life, The Case for Reincarnation, and Predictions. His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote the preface to The Case for Reincarnation.
In another piece about Fisher, by author Lewis Proud, it's mentioned that his father was a Baptist minister, and the family moved around a good bit in England because of his father's profession. His mother was also a Christian, and she apparently had psychic abilities. In Lewis Proud's piece, he quotes Fisher's sister, Jane Mason, as describing her mother as a staunch Christian whose psychic ability left her fretful lest God be displeased by her involuntary visions. In his book, Joe also mentions that his mother had recently, as of 1984, become a Jehovah's Witness, which I imagine must have been a source of strain in her marriage to a Baptist minister. Given his religious upbringing and his mother's psychic visions, it's perhaps not surprising that themes like religion and psychic abilities would play a role in his career as an author. Also, as an adult, Joe was apparently regarded as a rather attractive guy. Proud writes,
Romantic relationships were, in particular, a profound source of pain and frustration to Fisher, if not his Achilles heel. Like a dog chasing its own tail, his desire for romantic fulfillment could never be attained, causing him endless angst. According to David Kendall, who became best friends with Fisher in the early 1970s when the two of them worked as fellow reporters for the Toronto Sun, Fisher was the very definition of a ladies' man. He attracted women almost effortlessly. Women loved Joe. He was smiling, chatty, articulate, attractive, and not super macho. Kendall told me during a telephone interview that his friend's great problem in the realm of romance is that, while he managed to fall in love with many women, he failed to stay in love with a single one of them. Bubbling with genealogy and wry humor, Kendall went on to relate a story in which Fisher, having fallen in love with a particular woman, went up north to stay with her and her family in a cottage, only to return from his trip declaring that he didn't love her after all. In an email he wrote to me from his home in North Sydney suburb of Manly Vale, Malcolm Fisher, a conservationist and copywriter, expressed the opinion that he felt his older brother was looking for a soulmate. He just really loved women and they seemed to be enthusiastically drawn to him. Many maintained their friendships long after he had moved on to someone else. Maybe it pained him that he couldn't maintain the initial intensity of a relationship. Joe did love beautiful women, confirmed his sister Jane. I met many of his girlfriends and they were all lovely. Even though he didn't seem able to keep a long-term commitment to any of them, he still kept them as friends. I don't think he would ever intentionally hurt anyone. The person he most hurt was himself. He was looking for a perfect love and had such strong expectations of both himself and his partner.
So that's a basic sketch of who Joe Fisher was, at least at the time our mystery today begins.
When and where does it start?
In July of 1984 in Toronto, Canada, Joe's book on reincarnation had recently been published, and he did an interview about it on a local Toronto radio station, as you do. He explains what happened next.
My Canadian publisher forwarded a listener's letter from Aviva Neumann telling how she had involuntarily become a mouthpiece for supposedly discarnate entities, calling themselves guides. These entities, she pointed out, also spoke volubly about reincarnation. In fact, they claimed to be living in a disembodied state between lives. The tone of Aviva's letter assured me that she wasn't a New Age groupie with metaphysical stars in her eyes. Believing in nothing beyond the physical sciences, she worked as a laboratory technician and had always scoffed at psychic phenomena. Indeed, she felt vaguely troubled about being a channel for other beings. She was writing to me, she said, because she was looking for a rational explanation for this irrational turn of events. I'm a normal person with normal interests, she declared, and I don't want to be regarded as a candidate for a psychiatric ward. Aviva concluded her letter with a formal invitation. When you are next in Canada, she wrote, perhaps you would like to attend a session at my house and experience this phenomenon for yourself. Little did she know that, although I speak with an English accent, I live just a couple of miles from her Parkdale home, a revelation that prompted a gasp of surprise when I telephoned to accept her offer. In the course of my first visit, I was told that Aviva was suffering from chronic myelocytic leukemia, a life-threatening disease. When Roger Bellancourt, a neighbor, friend, and part-time hypnotist, had learned of her condition 2 years earlier, he immediately offered to hypnotize Aviva in order to administer corrective medical suggestions to her subconscious mind. Knowing nothing about hypnosis, Aviva felt that she should at least give it a try. So, in company with Roger and her doctor, she prepared 9 carefully worded commands that would be administered while she was in a trance. The commands ranged from, your bone marrow will start immediately to manufacture the extra red blood cells needed by your body, to the overproduction of myelocytic leukocytes will now cease.
And these hypnotic suggestions at least seemed to help Aviva with her leukemia. Now, I should mention that Aviva was from Australia, and Aviva Neumann isn't her real name. It's a pseudonym that Joe used in his book to protect her privacy. The names of other members of her group and other private persons have also been changed.
Already, we've mentioned several issues that we've discussed before in Mysterious World. Where can people go for more information about them?
Well, we discussed hypnosis in episode 52, so listeners can go to mysterious.fm/52 to hear, what I had to say about that. We discussed modern reincarnation research in episode 275, and again the next week in episode 276. So people can go to mysterious.fm/275 and mysterious.fm/276 for those. And Aviva is functioning as a medium, and we discussed mediums in general in episode 137. So that's mysterious.fm/137. Finally, for a careful Christian examination of communication with the deceased, I'd recommend listening to episode 270. So that's mysterious.fm/270. We've had other episodes on similar topics, but those are some of the key ones.
So what happened during Joe's first meeting with Aviva?
He learned about how even though she was being hypnotized to help with her health, she ended up channeling spirits.
I just wanted hypnotic medical suggestions to help my mind fight the leukemia, she said. That was all. But one thing led to another, and now these entities are speaking through me. I don't know who or what they are, and I don't really care. But from what Roger has told me, it seems that they are aware of what's going on inside my body and are doing their best to take care of me. Yet I've never believed in the so-called psychic world. I've never had a psychic reading that's come true. I think astrology is absolute crap, and I've got no time for anything that's supposed to be paranormal. Look at my library. I turned around to the bookcase behind me and saw it was crammed with volumes on the works of Karl Marx and Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I think that shows you where I stand, said Aviva, and it's not some airy-fairy world between incarnations.
So Aviva was a materialist who read books by atheistic communists and who worked in a scientific lab as a technologist. She didn't really believe in the spirits that were speaking through her, and she claimed not to have any memory of what they said. That's why her neighbor and hypnotist Roger was there. In any event, Roger and Aviva then gave Joe a demonstration. Roger put Aviva under hypnosis, and then...
Are we at a level where we may talk with the guides? Roger asked. For the first time, her lips parted. If you wish, she answered drowsily. Roger glanced at me and smiled modestly, as if to suggest that a dialogue would soon begin. He leaned over to a tape recorder which stood on a table behind the sofa and pressed the record button. Then, turning back to Aviva, he asked to speak to Russell. They had told me about Russell. Russell, Roger asked politely, could you give us some information about our visitor's guide? I stared unblinkingly at Aviva and waited. My stomach leapt as if to straddle the long pause between question and response. When her lips parted once more, her voice was barely recognizable. Gone was the high-pitched jocularity of the pronounced Australian lilt. Her enunciation was now unequivocally masculine. The English accent was unmistakable. This was an entirely different Aviva, strangely assertive and uncompromising. This was a voice which claimed to belong to Aviva's guide, a discarnate individual who had lived as a sheep farmer in Yorkshire during the last century. Speaking with all the conviction of a separate being, he was about to divulge the identity of the non-physical personage who is directly responsible for my welfare. My guide. The guide is female. Her name? Asked Roger. Philippa, in her past life. This is what she is known and goes by. And would she be willing to give her charge some information pertaining to herself as to her past life and what nationality she was? She says she has been with him many lifetimes, and he with her. They have alternated roles. Her last lifetime was in what is now known as Greece, from the years 1718 to 1771 on the Greek calendar, which is 5 days different from your own.
So Joe is now getting some experience of the guides that have been speaking through Aviva. Aviva's own guide was a 19th century shepherd from Yorkshire named Russell, and according to Russell, Joe's own guide was an 18th century Greek woman named Philippa, though they'd lived multiple lives together. Russell, the spirit guide, then had a question for Joe.
Have you no curiosity, he inquired, as to whether you may be a soul or an entity? I was expecting this. Roger had explained beforehand that the guides who speak through Aviva had insisted that there were two types of human beings on the planet, souls and entities. Souls were said to be created from desire, while entities were born of knowledge. Apparently, the two types differed fundamentally. Yes, I do, I replied apprehensively. Will you please tell me which I am? I would ask, Russell responded, which do you think you are? Mildly intimidated, I was not about to be drawn into making a choice. Aviva, whom I had met only a week earlier, had invited me to observe the guides because she thought I might be able to help her understand the state of garrulous unconsciousness in which she was now enveloped. An observer I wanted to remain. Besides, I knew very little about the concept of souls and entities and had difficulty with the idea that the human race was divided into two streams. I told Russell as much. Yes, I know, he intoned sympathetically. It has been rather poorly explained to you. You are, in fact, an entity. You have reasonable power as an entity. You have, in part, begun some forward development, although not on a conscious level. Most of your forward development has been on what you would term a subconscious level. You have never been a soul. You were always an entity created from knowledge, from the pool of knowledge which has been spoken of many times in many sessions.
This difference between souls and entities was one of the things that Aviva's spirit guides regularly discussed. They also were very concerned with forward development, basically spiritual self-improvement, and specifically understanding oneself, which they regarded as the purpose of all beings, both souls and entities, and in fact, the purpose of living different lives. One of the things that spirit guides were supposed to help us with is our own forward development. Only these guides didn't like being referred to as spirit guides. In fact, they didn't like being referred to as spirits at all. Whenever anyone would refer to them as a spirit, they would get annoyed and they would say that they are not spirits. Instead, they would say that they are people who simply don't have bodies at the moment. So this was a touchy point for them. Also, the difference between souls and entities had practical effects, because the guides that Aviva was channeling were entities, and they didn't give guidance to souls. Souls had their own guides, so you needed to go elsewhere to get guidance if you were a soul. Either that, or you could spend several lifetimes upgrading your status to that of an entity, because that's something souls can do. Joe was a little troubled by this soul-entity distinction, but at the moment, he didn't have much time to dwell on it.
Roger broke into my ruminations to ask whether I had any questions for my guide. Although he felt that Filippa would be unable to speak directly through Aviva on this occasion, he assured me that she would soon be able to talk with her own voice. Roger volunteered to act as an intermediary in the interim, explaining that guides first had to learn the energies if they wished to communicate through a human vehicle.
So within a few weeks, Filippa would learn how to speak through Aviva, and then she could speak with Joe directly, without having to use Russell as an intermediary guide. Also,
Filippa says, offered Russell, that she would be the most delighted if personal contact were to be made with her. She says your knowledge and your self-discipline and your style of thought processes makes you what she calls a good candidate for communication on a direct level. Then you could receive direction from her. How should I make this direct contact? She suggests that if you put aside the same particular moment each day on the earthbound plane to establish thought control patterns upon herself, this would be a good start. For one who has contact with a guide has a more open resource for control of his or her own destiny.
So it was even possible that Joe and Filippa could learn to have direct contact. He thus wouldn't need to use Aviva to speak with her, and that direct access with his guide could help him make more forward development or spiritual progress. Ultimately, however, Joe wasn't fully successful in making direct contact with Filippa. He did get a few mental images from her, such as of a spot in the Greek countryside where they used to meet back when they were lovers in the 1700s, And he also would get a kind of buzzing in his ears when she was present, but he never really learned to speak with her telepathically. However, at the moment, Russell pointed out another benefit of having contact with Philippa.
This would also offer new companionship, and she says there is much instability of companionship in your life, Russell said. These words were instantly unnerving, as I had long experienced some difficulty in sustaining romantic relationships. I had barely learned of my guide's existence, and now she was identifying this source of personal concern. Was this apparent weakness, I wondered, already undermining the life I shared with Rachel, my living girlfriend? Silently, I speculated whether Philippa had intimate knowledge of my dealings with others. Though I believed I had some very good friends, perhaps some of my friendships were more flawed than I realized. Whatever Philippa's words were meant to suggest, her immediate recognition of my vulnerability was unsettling, to put it mildly. She feels, added Russell, that she can become the old sock of comfort. Warming to this remark, I requested some information on the last relationship we had shared on Earth. She says this was for her during the immediate past life in Greece. You were a male, and she was a female. You were to be her suitor. However, you both transgressed in the eyes of the community. You were sent from the village and did not return. She says she did not wish for this to happen. However, the village is more powerful than the one. The village is more powerful than the one. The phrase was sonorous, poetic, and conjured images of Greece. 10 years earlier, I had composed most of my first novel on the Greek isle of Siphonos. I had loved Greece, its culture, and its people, and I could readily imagine that I had once incarnated in that richly atmospheric land. Sitting on the floor of Aviva's living room, I found myself breathing the air of a bygone era, roaming parched valleys and ancient crypts. I imagined Philippa's dark eyes and long black tresses. So magnificently seductive was the moment that I wanted to merge with the reverie.
So this fits with what other people have said about Joe, that he had trouble forming long-lasting romantic relationships. He did have a girlfriend named Rachel who he was living with at the moment, but he didn't have a source of long-lasting romantic satisfaction, and maybe his former lover and spirit guide Philippa could be a source of comfort to him. But Joe was an investigator, and he wasn't going to simply accept a good-sounding narrative.
The skeptic inside screamed in protest, demanding that Philippa's credibility be established before the dreamer was granted any further indulgence. Could Philippa tell me, I asked, when I arrived in Canada and from whence I came? She says your concept of time is quite different from her own, and that she has not had to work with earthbound time since her departure from the earthbound plane. It is difficult, especially when there has been virtually no contact of a spontaneous nature between herself and her charge. She does not understand what you mean by the term coming to Canada. She says you were born on the earthbound plane and have not left the earthbound plane in this lifetime. What do you mean by Canada? I was charmed by Philippa's lack of geographical knowledge. After all, if she hadn't lived on Earth for over 200 years, her ignorance of Canada was quite understandable. She asked, Russell inquired, was this a known place when she was last on the earthbound plane? No, I conceded. That's an interesting point because Canada was only formed as a nation in 1867. She departed the earthbound plane many years prior to that.
This brings up two of the themes that regularly occur in Aviva's guides. The first is that they claim time works very differently in their realm. In fact, so they sometimes say time doesn't exist. And so figuring out how to express things in terms of earthly time is difficult for them. Also, despite the fact that they're spiritually guiding people on Earth, they don't have a lot of knowledge of the changes that have happened on Earth. So Philippa doesn't know about Canada, for example, and she and other guides don't understand modern technological devices. So the members of Aviva's circle have to figure out how to explain modern technology to the guides in terms they can understand. Fortunately, Philippa was able to provide Joe with some information about where they had lived before.
She says that in tiny places like Theros, where you and she lived, it was difficult to learn of the outside world. Information could be gleaned only from those who pass through the village, usually from the Black Sea en route to larger centers. Theros. This is where we lived together for a while? Theros. Is this an island or the name of a community? This is a village. It is, she says, only 5 days' walk from the Black Sea.
Shortly after this, the session with Russell concluded, and Roger brought Aviva out of hypnosis, and they explained to her what she said.
What happened after Joe's initial encounter with Aviva and her guides?
Well, he was an author on paranormal subjects, and so he started thinking about writing a book about discarnate beings, meaning spirits, even if they didn't want to be called spirits. And so, in another session, he had a question for Russell.
Do you feel, I inquired, that it would be a good idea for me to write a book about guides? At the moment, no, Russell replied abruptly. You have not enough knowledge. What I mean is to start researching a book. If you research that book and thoroughly research it and take nothing for granted. And if, when you are satisfied with your research, you research your research. Yes, perhaps for you, with the nature of the work you have been involved in, this would be a good thing. But I would say that you are perhaps entering dangerous ground. So long as you continue to ask questions, so long as you continue your own forward development, so long as you do not impede the forward development of guides, yes, this might be very good for you. But I knew from the tenor of Russell's voice that a warning was imminent. I would caution you that nothing is to be taken at face value. If it is easily believed on faith or taken on what you may term face value, then perhaps it is a little valueless. Do you feel I should go to various people who claim to be in contact with their guides to establish what the role of a guide is? Perhaps the first thing you must establish is whether a guide is in fact a guide or a playful spirit, or not a guide at all. Naturally, I wanted to know how to differentiate one from the other. You will find where there are playful spirits, or perhaps what you may term fakes, you will find more souls, more belief, more acceptance without questioning. If you do not recognize one from the other with alacrity, you may find yourself in a soul entrapment type of situation. You are a very intelligent man. You have chosen well. However, I must caution you. Even the most intelligent among us have and will be again caught in soul entrapments. I asked Russell for some advice on how to avoid this miserable-sounding fate. He replied by cautioning me even more sternly than before to conduct my inquiry armed with a highly critical attitude and a barrage of perceptive questions. You must proceed into this field of work, if you intend to proceed with it, with a deliberate amount of skepticism, a large amount of knowledge, and a vast amount of accurate questions that will indeed single out reality from that which is basic belief, mysticism, falsehood. Do not accept at face value. Question. All the time, question. And if questions are not answered satisfactorily, question and question again.
So this is good. Russell, the spirit guide, is telling Joe not to just accept what he's told. Don't just accept it when a spirit or an apparent spirit tells you something. Rather than telling Joe to just take whatever the guide says on faith, be skeptical and test it. It may not be a guide at all. In fact, Russell says it may be what he calls a playful spirit or a fake. And as we'll see, Joe took this advice. He did test the spirits, both those that were speaking through Aviva and those speaking through other mediums.
How did Aviva first make contact with the guides?
Well, her neighbor Roger had been hypnotizing her to help her with her leukemia, and he would test how deep her trance was by asking questions, such as about the state of her health. But he also found that she would sometimes report memories of past lives, such as being a Czechoslovakian teenager in World War II who was put in a labor camp and eventually executed by the Nazis. And upon request, Aviva was able to speak authentic words and phrases in the Czech languages, so that was a validating sign. Aviva also started talking about the need for forward development, and that, being the purpose of reincarnation, though she argued against all this once she was awake again.
No matter how ardently the hypnotized Aviva enthused about the wonders of unconsciousness, the waking Aviva fought hard to discredit everything she said while in trance. The laboratory technologist whose hero was Lenin and whose attitudes and ideological principles were solidly grounded in the material world swore Roger to secrecy about the sessions because she feared being classified as mentally disturbed. As she grudgingly listened to tapes of the sessions, she complained that the information could not be verified, properly understood, or used in the here and now. Moreover, she maintained the material contradicted her conscious knowledge. Aviva's griping became so virulent that Roger decided to consult his entranced subject about her antagonism. This is how she responded. Whether she, at this time, believes the information is not relevant, what is relevant is that she questions and starts to seek and therefore opens more the door to knowledge. Do not underestimate the power of questioning. There is no contradictory information. What she finds contradictory merely contradicts her own beliefs. In acknowledging an understanding of the material, she must also acknowledge, therefore, that her beliefs are in jeopardy. The waking Aviva was not about to be persuaded by such sophistry. Wary of postulation, she wanted to know whether her altered state could produce something of practical benefit, such as the coveted digits that would bring home a lottery jackpot. Dutifully, Roger broached the topic at the earliest opportunity. Much to Aviva's subsequent irritation, the exchange went like this. Are you able to go into the future and look at a newspaper? Yes. Would you be able to retrieve winning lottery numbers for us? If it is part of your plan to have that amount of money, you could influence the numbers yourselves. Monetary gain is nothing that can be lasting.
So the unconscious Aviva wasn't going to help them win the lottery, but she would talk about the importance of forward development, and it raised a question in Roger's mind. Back in the 1970s, he had tried automatic writing, which we may talk about in a future episode, and the only message he got was one from a spirit guide called Jai Lin, who said he was a Tibetan Lama and that he was Roger's own personal guide. Roger was freaked out by this and quit automatic writing. But with Aviva talking about forward development, he decided to ask her about this while she was hypnotized. Speaking with what Joe calls her alter consciousness.
I understand that my spirit guide is Jai Lin. Is it possible for me to contact him in this manner? To whom do you wish to speak? Aviva responded sluggishly. To whomever can answer the question. Roger and Aviva's friend Helen waited patiently. They were used to waiting patiently at the altar of the alter conscious, but this pause seemed to last forever. When the reply finally came, Roger and Helen found themselves staring at each other, stunned and incredulous. Yes, it is possible to contact the guides. The guides' distinctive voices, however, did not materialize overnight. For several months, the alter consciousness acted as intermediary, replaying messages from the next world. Aviva's guide was identified as Russell Parnick, who, in his previous life, had lived as an illiterate sheep farmer in the Yorkshire Dales more than 100 years earlier. He also claimed to have been Aviva's wife during a 14th century existence. Helen was said to be guided by an entity called Mi Lao, who was last incarnated as a peasant woman in the walled city of Shitsu in China's Hunan province during the 17th century. And then there was Jai Lin.
But Jai Lin didn't stay with Roger long. Roger wasn't big on taking the advice that Jai Lin had on offer, and so Jai Lin dumped him and left. This left Roger getting a new spirit guide named Sabotwan, but Sabotwan wasn't that interested in helping Roger, so Roger decided to take a more positive attitude, and he was rewarded by getting a better guide, a new one named Hani, who had been his mother in a past life in Holland. So be aware that if you don't follow your guide's advice, they can dump you, and you might get one that's not as good. However, all of this happened before Joe met Aviva.
Once he'd made contact with Aviva, how were things going for Joe?
Well, not particularly well. As we've heard, he had a problem establishing long-lasting romantic relationships, and now he learned that his guide was a woman named Philippa, who he'd been a lover with in a previous life in Greece. which was a country that he loved. And so this was all very romantic for him. He now had, in effect, an ideal lover, a woman of his dreams, and he was trying to learn how to communicate with her directly.
Knowing that Philippa was also struggling to communicate gave the incentive to keep on trying. Not all was well at home, however. Rachel was offended by the avidity with which I would discuss the guides, and I learned to mention Philippa as little as possible in her presence. Perhaps she questioned my loyalty, sensing my attraction to this unearthly lover of old. Anyway, Rachel no more than tolerated my striving for communion with the next world. And over a period of several months, her pain forbearance turned imperceptibly into withdrawal. Not that I deserved any better. The guide's gripping expositions of life beyond the body left me increasingly preoccupied with the non-material universe, and less willing to be able to respond to Rachel on a basic human level. Aside from renouncing my otherworldly aspirations, an unthinkable course of action, there seemed little I could do to prevent our feelings for one another from drifting into cold storage. Philippa's remarkable understanding and empathy cushioned my progressive alienation from Rachel, my friends, and the world about me. In any case, I told myself, personal happiness in the current existence was a small sacrifice to make for one's immortal welfare. Besides, I was as happy as I could reasonably expect to be. If life was sometimes distressing, it was because Rachel and I were always arguing. We loved one another, but we had little in common and were loath to compromise with each other's views and preferences. Although Rachel's affections ran deep, she neither accepted my personality nor my outlook on life. She protested that Philippa catered unfairly to my idealistic impulses and grumbled that my guide should be more considerate of her emotions. But I refused to listen to these complaints. So far as I was concerned, Philippa loved me unreservedly as I was, and that meant a lot. I was determined that Rachel's ambivalence would not deter my spiritual quest. Philippa was that quest. In getting to know my guide, I was honing my immortal destiny while preparing for the time when we would be together once more in the between-life state.
So as you can hear, Joe's relationship with his current girlfriend, Rachel, was deteriorating. He tried inviting Rachel to the meetings with Aviva to get her interested too, and she did go, but she didn't become a regular member of the group. Others, however, did. In late 1984, Joe started inviting people he knew to the sessions with Aviva, and by the spring of 1985, there were between 10 and 30 people showing up each week. Aviva's guide, Russell, would quickly identify which of the new attendees were entities and which were souls. And if you were lucky enough to be an entity, Russell would tell you who your own guide was. If you were a soul, then, as we mentioned earlier, he couldn't help you. But there were still lots of new guides to meet.
The burgeoning cast of characters, including Ernest, who had fought in World War II as a bomber pilot with the Royal Air Force, Sanji, a wealthy landowner from Kathmandu, Nepal, who died of natural causes at the age of 66. Tuktu, who lived in Ceylon in his most recent incarnation, yet whose name hailed from a life in Korea. Kingala, an African huntsman from the 15th century who lived on the Mother River near the Mother Lake. Franco, an Argentinian tailor who died in political upheaval in 1903. David, a farm boy from South Carolina who loved fishing. We watched spellbound as Aviva cruised from tribal African base to prime upper-class English to rippling Anglo-Indian to Carolina draw to broad Scottish and back again. If she was acting, she was not only brilliant, she was inhumanly so.
They also learned more about the world of the guides.
Each guide was responsible for a number of living human charges, possibly as many as 100 or more, depending on ability and experience. These charges were people living on Earth with whom they were karmically bounded as a result of having shared intense experience in previous incarnations. We who were incarnate today could, in turn, become guides ourselves after death or transition. Conversely, the guides, our co-explorers aboard the seemingly endless shuttle of rebirth, were expected to return to the earthbound plane in the cause of their own personal evolution. The guides were assisted by apprentices, whom were also linked to the embodied personality through shared past life experiences.
So that may have been where Sabatwan and Hani had come from after Jai-Lin stopped serving as Roger's guide. They may have been among Jai-Lin's apprentices, and so they took over duties as Roger's guide when he moved on. Only each guide was actually watching over dozens of other people. They also learned about the origin and destiny of entities.
Both guides and their charges were said to have originated from the Great Pool of Knowledge. By means of successive incarnations and subsequent progression through non-physical planes, we were making our way back to that pure state of being where individuality would be freely and willingly surrendered. The information relayed by the guides, while interpreted for earthly understanding, was retrieved from this vast knowledge pool.
So we, or rather the entities among us, came from a great pool of knowledge, and we're destined to return to that great pool where we will cease to be individuals, kind of like the great link that the changelings come from on Star Trek. And it appears that the great pool of knowledge would be primarily spiritual knowledge, like what you need for forward development. But it didn't appear to contain a lot of practical knowledge, since, as we mentioned, the guides didn't know things about technological developments on Earth after their own times.
If the guides had information about the origin and destiny of humans, or at least human entities, did they have much to say about God?
They had a little, but not as much as you might think. Joe explains.
Even the guides had their limitations. We were told that to explain the nature of God would take 300 sessions, a daunting project which was never attempted. And in answer to the question, who created the first soul, Russell confessed his ignorance. I do not have exposure to that type of knowledge, and I'll not gain that in your terms for some time yet. I cannot even conceive where I might locate information of that description for you. You see, we think more in terms of the movement, accumulation, and the use of accumulated knowledge. So much data was available, nevertheless, that it scarcely seemed to matter that mankind's farthest origins would remain a mystery.
However, the guides did have some additional information about Jesus Christ.
While I hasten to agree with the guide's assertion that Orthodox religion was littered with half-truths and mistaken notions of non-physical reality, I was surprised, very surprised, to hear Russell state one evening that Jesus Christ was no more evolved than any member of our group. We were chatting about great religious leaders and their ability to influence the masses when Russell announced, "The one you call Jesus Christ has of course been back to the earthbound many, many times." Has he? I replied incredulously. Heavens, yes. Even after living the life of Jesus Christ, one still needs to return to the earthbound plane? He was just a man. But he accomplished so much in terms of knowledge, and no, he didn't. He managed to get people to follow him. All he did was speak the truth. He never faltered in his own religion. He never faltered in his own morals. He simply acted as any teacher acts, and engendered no more karma than any other teacher. But when you say that he was a particularly evolved human being, I persisted. No, Russell declared, no more than the rest of you. It was just that he spoke out and people needed something to hang on to, for they were in desperate times. In desperate times, there's always someone who will speak out and gain a following. But few could speak out as he did, Russell. I think you will find that what has been received about his life has been quite distorted. The fantasy is hung on long after the man has gone, and it has been blown bigger and bigger with each generation. What about Buddha? I inquired. Has he reincarnated? Do you know? Buddha has a different aspect altogether. The one who you call the Buddha has not reincarnated to my knowledge. So what sort of status would Jesus Christ have today? I don't believe he's on the earthbound plane at the moment. Does he still have lots to learn? Oh, the same as yourself, Russell said dismissively. If you were living in desperate times and you spoke out with your books, you too might be revered. In 2, 4, 5, 700, 1800 years, you too might be painted as some savior, when in fact you were no more than a man who spoke his mind.
So the guides weren't particularly big on Jesus. But at least Joe was making progress meditating in his attempts to have direct contact with Philippa. They didn't have full telepathic contact so that they could really have mental conversations, but they were getting a kind of closeness.
Each morning we were having more and more fun as I dedicated myself to making contact. In stepping up my meditative exercise, I had taken to visualizing myself hugging Philippa, a development that drew a number of appreciative comments. She seemed to craze the developing closeness at least as much as I did. I think sometimes I get more selfish as we get more, because I want more, Philippa confessed one Friday night. Do you mean that you want me to spend longer with you in the morning? I asked. Or do you want me to contact you on more occasions? I think I just want more hugs. If Philippa could have assumed a physical body, I'm sure I would have married her. But she was only a voice that resonated with more love, compassion, and perspicacity than I had ever known. Within the space of a few months, she had demonstrated an acute awareness of my feelings and foibles. She knew the people in my life and their effect upon me. She was even able to relate specific circumstances in which I had found myself, situations unknown to Aviva or anyone who attended what Philippa chose to call our groupings.
So that's interesting. Joe says that when speaking through Aviva, Philippa was aware of and able to describe specific circumstances about what was going on in his life, even though neither Aviva nor anyone else in the sessions knew about these situations. He doesn't give examples, but if Philippa was able to relate, if what she was able to relate went beyond random chance guessing, then that would be evidence that something paranormal was really happening here.
In learning to accept my transparency, I anticipated our chats with a potent mix of longing and apprehension. Waiting for Philippa to speak through Aviva's lips, I felt nervously vulnerable. And why wouldn't I? She was able to discern my every thought and deed, an attribute which made her love even more remarkable. Just as she knew me, I felt intuitively that I knew her too. But such intimacy brought in its wake a certain terror that sometimes curdled my elation. True privacy had been surrendered to Philippa's loving attachment. And though I was grateful for her ministrations, my life was no longer my own. At the time, I would have denied that the guides were exerting great influence over me, my attitudes, and my behavior. Yet every time I contemplated a major decision in my life, I sought Philippa's approval. Would my anticipated course of action contribute to my goal of forward development? Before, such thinking had always been unconscious. I had tried to do that which would not wage war on my conscience. Now my conscience had become personified as Philippa, who, for all her love and devotion, was an all-seeing inquisitor. Knowing that she was watching every move left me self-absorbed, tense, and less inclined to act spontaneously.
But Philippa was able to help Joe figure out what his purpose in life, or at least this life, was. It was a plan that had been made before he was born.
I was glad to learn that I was indeed treading the path delineated in my karmic script. My principal goal for this incarnation, Philippa explained, was to disseminate on a wide scale knowledge of that which lies beyond earthly reality. Apparently, this objective had been karmically inspired by an earlier desert life in Sumeria, in which, following a volcanic eruption, I deliberately kept secret the whereabouts of a supply of fresh water. Many perished, I was told, because I withheld this life-giving information from others. Today, although circumstances were very different, my predicament was the same. Once more, the challenge was to spread the news rather than keep it to myself.
So this was good. Joe could fulfill his plan for life and further his forward development by publishing the book that he was planning on writing about the guides and spreading their teachings far and wide so that more people could know about them and be benefited from them. Still, not everything was going as well as it could.
With great reluctance, I decided in September 1985 that Rachel and I must part. Although the breakup was not precipitated by the guides, they were decidedly a factor in our failure to close the gulf that separated us. My guide, after all, was not only a guide. She was a lover who talked to me as such. Rachel's jealousy, I realized at last, was perfectly understandable. Later, Rachel confessed that she had known our relationship was doomed as soon as I was introduced to Philippa's unconditional love. She knew that she would never be able to compete with such affections and spoke of feeling heartsick when listening to Philippa's amorousness. Rachel insisted that it was relatively easy to conduct a relationship with a discarnate entity, but much more taxing to apply oneself to making a partnership work in the face of daily pressures.
And I have to agree with Rachel here. Relating to a real-life person is more challenging than relating to a dream lover that only exists in your mind. In fact, that's why people imagine dream lovers in the first place, because they're much easier to please than real people, which means that the love they give you is just a fake. It's a fantasy, a cheap imitation of the real thing that exists between a man and a woman who are committed to each other in real life. That would be the case here as well, if Philippa wasn't real, of course. Fortunately, now that Rachel was out of his life, Joe could focus on what he could learn from Philippa and the other guides.
Now that my interest in Philippa and the guides was unhampered by any conflicting considerations, I steeped myself still further in the apparently infinite supply of knowledge which lay on the far side of the trance state. So rich and so abundant were the insights and observations that there were at times when I felt overwhelmed by the veritable geyser of information. We were being regaled with lengthy expositions about life on the lost continents of Atlantis and Lemuria. We were learning about the inner workings of the mind, which was said to have some 10,000 levels. We were lectured, among other things, on the intricate symbiosis of the guide-charge relationship, the pursuit and discharge of one's karmic workload, and the process of choosing one's parents. Everyone, it was explained, had strong karmic connections with at least one of his or her parents-to-be, who were identified and selected long before the actual birth took place.
Still, if Joe was going to fulfill his destiny and write his book about the guides, he needed confirmation of what they were saying, just like Aviva's guide Russell had told him way back at the beginning. He needed to apply a healthy dose of skepticism and rigorously check what was being said. Research is research, he had been told. Question, and question again. So as part of his forward development, Joe decided that the time had come to do just that.
Were our guides telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Were they legitimate heirs to the long-standing tradition of a sense of presence? These questions I knew had to be answered, and answered objectively in my study of our allies in the next dimension. Mind-to-mind contact, paranormally acquired information, and uncanny intervention were all very impressive to individual witnesses within our group setting. But they were as empirically inadmissible as the guides' assertions about discarnate life, if only because they could not be validated. However, our guides' insistence that they had spent previous existences on Earth opened up a much more promising avenue of exploration. Mercifully, this insistence carried within itself the seeds of the ultimate test. For if the guides had lived before in relatively recent times, surely traces of their lives must still exist. And if I could recover those traces in records, deeds, registers, I would have incontrovertible evidence that the mysterious voices had, indeed, once inhabited human bodies. Most exhilarating of all, this evidence would confirm the knowledge of our hearts, the knowledge that love and concern rain down on us routinely from the next dimension.
One of the members of Aviva's group was a poet named Tony Zambellis, and he had a guide named Ernest who had lived in the 20th century. He'd been a pilot in England during World War II, and Joe was from England. So he decided to make Ernest his first test case.
So it was that Ernest was invited to divulge the contents of his memory, paying particular attention to names, dates, and events that could be corroborated. According to Russell, my request was by no means unreasonable. We have no impediment to memory here, he stated flatly. Early on, Ernest confided that Ernest had not been his name in the most recent life. He had adopted Ernest, he said, because it had been his name in a particularly beloved incarnation 15 lifetimes ago. Had we been more perceptive, we would have understood from the beginning that this statement implied a general dissatisfaction with the existence during the last war. The reason for his despondency became apparent, however, as time passed and he revealed more of himself and his feelings. These feelings notwithstanding, Ernest fully understood my desire to learn details of his life and then to seek corroborations. With a certain eagerness in his melancholic, well-educated voice, he agreed to provide me with all the information he could muster. In his last life, said Ernest, he was Flying Officer William Alfred Scott of 99 Squadron, Group 3 Bomber Command. He described himself as 5 feet 11 inches in height, with dark hair and dark brown eyes. His comment, "I used to try to trim my weight at 11 stone, 154 pounds, suggested that he was inclined to be overweight. He was born in Brighton, raised in Bristol, the names of streets and schools were provided, and for 3 years had attended Bristol University, where he studied mathematics and engineering. He even named one of his professors, Jonathan Langley, quite a colorful chap, he said, who taught mathematics. Ernest joined the RAF in 1937 at the age of 20, and as a member of 99 Squadron was based at RAF Mendenhall, Suffolk from early in 1939, moving to Newmarket Heath in September that year, just before the outbreak of war. Some 18 months later, he was transferred with the rest of the squadron to RAF Waterbeach, an air base that was cut into the Fens, the name given to the low-lying area of East Anglia, and CAMS, a typically English abbreviation for Cambridgeshire. It was from Waterbeach, he said, that most of his bombing missions were conducted. He spoke with great affection and enthusiasm about the aircraft he flew, the Wimpy or Vickers Wellington bomber.
Ernest gave Joe other information too, but one subject he was reluctant to talk about was his death.
Ironically, Ernest said that he did not die in the air but in a bombing raid on Coventry in 1944. He was 27 years of age. Just why he was in Coventry remained a mystery because Ernest refused to talk candidly on the subject. On one occasion he suggested, discarnate tongue placed firmly in cheek, he was on business. On another occasion when I suggested that he might have been visiting somebody, he replied, "That's a nice way of putting it, yes."
So I take that to mean that Ernest was in Coventry visiting a lover when the bombing raid happened.
Whatever his reason for being in Coventry, he said that he was not killed instantly, although he was long gone by the time his body was finally discovered under a collapsed building on a street called Sandwich, northeast of Coventry Cathedral. Ernest had delivered the information spontaneously, without pause, and at times with considerable emotion. He impressed us all at being eminently human and entirely plausible. His speech was a catalogue of specific detail that could be verified or refuted. Everyone in the group was excited when my preliminary research in Toronto libraries swiftly confirmed the locations of East Anglian bomber bases at Mendenhall, Newmarket Heath, and Waterbeach, as well as the existence of 99 Squadron and its use of Wellington bombers in wartime. I learned too that just as Ernest had said, 99 Squadron was called the Madras Presidency Squadron and bore the Leaping Puma on its badge, and that the Vickers Wellington bomber was known as a Wimpy, the name being derived from J. Wellington Wimpy, a character in the Popeye cartoons who had an insatiable appetite for hamburgers.
All this was very encouraging. Joe had been able to verify a bunch of things that Ernest had told him, but he still needed to verify other things, like had Ernest, a flying officer named William Alfred Scott, actually existed? Had he joined the Royal Air Force in 1937? Was he in the 99th Squadron? And did he die in Coventry in 1944? This being 1985, and thus a decade before the internet was publicly available, the needed information couldn't be easily checked in Toronto, so he decided to make a trip to England to visit his parents and do the research there to check out the rest of what Ernest had said. So he went to the Public Records Office and checked the records. He also talked to other members of the 99th Squadron.
I spent several hours in the Public Record Office scanning page after page of the 99 Squadron logbooks, searching the list of six-man bomber crews for F.O. William Alfred Scott. At the end of the afternoon, it was heartbreaking to admit to myself that I had searched in vain. Sergeant Scott was there, a pilot whose first name was indeed Malcolm, but there was no flying officer Scott. not in all the operation logbook spanning 3 years of wartime activity. My mind rejected the void revealed by my eyes and fingers. Surely he must be there. I walked out into the thin February sunshine bewildered and crestfallen beyond belief. How could Ernest's description of life with 99 Squadron be so lifelike and so accurate in part, yet so much in error? I proceeded to investigate the remaining information that Ernest had imparted, looking on with growing distress as the existence of William Alfred Scott utterly and irretrievably collapsed. At St. Catherine's House, London, where births, marriages, and deaths for England and Wales since 1837 are registered, no William Alfred Scott had been born in Brighton in 1917, or had died in Coventry in 1944. No William Alfred Scott had enrolled in Bristol University from 1935 to 1937, and no Jonathan Langley had been a faculty member there. According to Kelly's Directory of Bristol and Suburbs, 1926, there was no Hill Road in the city, the street where Ernest claimed to have lived, and, in further contradiction of his testimony, no Princess Victoria School, or even a Princess Victoria Street. Investigations showed that, like so many other assertions, the alleged place of his death, a street called Sandwich, did not exist. By now, I was thoroughly frustrated with my efforts to confirm the claims most crucial to Ernest's contention that he had lived in 20th century Britain. While much of the information could be corroborated, anything which hinged directly on the existence of William Alfred Scott was proved false. Without question, I had been lied to over and over again, and I was burning to return to Toronto to confront Ernest with this heartfelt complaint.
And since this was a trip to visit his parents, Joe apparently talked the situation over with them.
Underneath my anger, I tried to fathom the meaning of the flaws in Ernest's testimony. If Ernest was not William Alfred Scott, who was he? My mother had an answer. It was predictable enough, I suppose, leaping straight out of years of Christian conditioning. Demons, she said, her voice quivering a little. You're talking to demons. I don't like the sound of it one bit.
And with that, we want to pause here and take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including David S., Robert C., Ann T., Caleb P., and Michael M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. Customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. So, Jimmy, what happened when Joe got back to Toronto? Did Ernest have a good explanation for why Joe couldn't find a record of him?
When Joe got back to Toronto, he found that Ernest had already been making excuses to the other members of the group. For example, when his charge, Tony Zambellis, asked what his birthday as William Alfred Scott had been, Ernest said he'd have to think about it because the guides don't remember cluttering information that has nothing to do with forward development, even though Russell had previously said we have no impediment to memory here. Also, when Joe telephoned from England and said he couldn't find William Alfred Scott, Roger the hypnotist asked Ernest about this, and he got a big lecture about invading Ernest's privacy, or privacy. Ernest also said that he had done things in his prior life that he wasn't proud of, and so he had covered his tracks, apparently by omitting or changing certain key details, which Joe took as a tacit admission that Ernest had lied to him. He also said that prying into these matters would somehow endanger his living charge, Tony, and Ernest even threatened to pull out of the group if his privacy was further violated. When Joe did get back, he confronted Ernest during one of Aviva's sessions, but the debate was inconclusive and left him frustrated. It also left him suspicious of Ernest and his motives.
How did this part of the story end? Did Ernest pull out of the group?
Well, he didn't just walk away in a huff, but very quickly he announced that he was going to be reincarnating on Earth. So he would be stepping away from the entity guiding business for the moment, because a suitable unborn child had been found, and so Tony would be getting a new guide. This guide was a British World War I veteran named William Harry Maddox, who was a lot more fun than Ernest, and Joe says he quickly became the comedian among the guides. But Joe did not forget about Ernest or his desire to verify things about him.
I was mindful that the time was drawing near for Ernest's rebirth. Ever in search of verification, I asked Russell to supply me with details concerning Ernest's reincarnation. I wanted a name for the newborn entity, a date of birth, and a location, data that I could subsequently check against birth records in the United Kingdom. Russell said that he would endeavor to consult Ernest's guide and the guides of his parents-to-be, and if all went well, would retrieve the information I had requested. As the weeks went by, I kept asking Russell whether there was any news. Week after week, he replied in the negative. Then, toward the end of July, Russell announced that he had received notice of Ernest's re-entry into the material world. His birth had taken place, he said, on 13 July. His new name was Thomas Hugh Graham. His birthplace was the county of Kent in southern England, and his parents' Christian names were Hugh and Susan. Eagerly, I made a note of the particulars and longed for the time when I could justify making another trip to England. Russell suggested that the information could be validated were I to dispatch an inquiry to England by carrier. However, rather than rely on the postal system and long-distance dealings with bureaucrats, I decided to wait for the opportunity to conduct a personal search.
So the next year, 1986, he did go to England to check the records.
There was a Thomas Hugh Graham, but he was not born in Kent, as the guides had said, and there was no way of knowing immediately whether he was born on 13 July. To find out, I had to fill in an application for a full birth certificate, which I did. Several weeks later, sometime after I had returned to Toronto, the certificate I had ordered arrived in the mail. Anxiously, I opened the envelope and scanned its contents. To my great relief and satisfaction, the pink ink-scrawled certificate was inscribed almost the way I dared to expect. Thomas Hugh Graham, birth date 13 July 1985, parents Hugh and Susan Graham, birthplace Aldershot, Hampshire. It was all just as Russell had said, with one exception. The birthplace was located in Aldershot, Hampshire, rather than in Kent, which lay 35 miles away. Triumphantly, I carried the birth certificate with me to the next session at Aviva's home and announced the news to cheers and applause.
So this was evidence that even though Joe hadn't been able to verify Ernest's previous life, he was able to verify his new one. All the details matched in a way that goes well beyond random chance, with only one detail being mistaken, the town of his birth. Everything else was the same, his new name, his birthday, and the names of his new mother and father. It was a consoling round of confirmation.
What was going on with the larger group at this time?
Well, Tony Zambellis, whose initial guide had been Ernest, invited a friend of his to start coming to the group, and the friend's name was Sanford Ellison. He was a management consultant. Sanford also had a wife named Betty, and the two of them started attending the sessions. It turned out that Sanford was an entity, and he had a guide named Tuktu, who had lived in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, as it's now called. But his wife, Betty, was only a soul, not an entity. So she didn't have a guide that the group could contact. Soul guides existed on a different plane of reality that the entity guides didn't have access to. Still, Betty kept coming to the sessions, along with 2 or 3 other souls who were very interested, even though they couldn't speak to their guides. Betty even made snacks to bring to the sessions. But there were some potential dangers.
The guides were still stressing that an entity was not necessarily better than a soul, but they were also saying that an entity's forward development could be impaired by teaming up with a soul in a business or personal relationship. In Russell's words, generally speaking, when an entity and a soul are contracting each other, the middle ground is reached. That is, forward development for the soul and regression for the entity. Indirectly, Sanford was being told that his marriage, while a positive experience for Betty, was detrimental to his personal growth.
However, what was good for Sanford was that he and Aviva had a lot of karmic connections. They had spent multiple lives together, much more than the number he had spent with Betty. And because of their close karmic connections, there was something Sanford could do to help Aviva. His guide, Tuktu, explained,
Soon after Tuktu began to communicate in his own voice, Russell asked Roger to arrange a private chat between Sanford and himself. In the ensuing discussion, Sanford learned that Aviva had leukemia and that under current conditions she had only 3 months to live. There was hope, however, that her life could be saved, hope that rested entirely with himself. Russell said Sanford's energies were perfectly compatible with Aviva's and that he was the only member of the group capable of channeling healing to her disease-ridden body. Sanford was informed that he had been developing his capacity to heal over 5 previous lifetimes. To assist in Aviva's recovery, said Russell, would be an ideal way to work on discharging his karmic debt. So it was that Sanford learned how to channel energy from Tuktu through his mind and into his fingertips, which were placed successively according to the guide's instructions on various parts of Aviva's body. It was as though my forehead was connected to my hands, Sanford said of the healing sensation. My hands and fingers would get quite hot. I would know when the work was completed on a particular area, the sensation of heat would die away. The difficulty always lay in blanking out the conscious mind. In time, I could tell where the problem areas were. The direction was mine, but the healing energy came from the guides.
So after Roger put Aviva under hypnosis, the guides, like Russell and Tuktu, would direct Sanford where to put his hands on Aviva's body to direct healing energy into her and save her life. Well, it worked. She survived the 3 months that Tuktu had said she had left, but this was going to require ongoing healing efforts. Soon, these healing sessions were happening more and more often.
Within 4 months of requesting the original private chat with Sanford, Russell announced that he wanted Sanford to be able to lead Aviva into trance. Russell's wishes were made unmistakably clear after Roger vacillated rather than acting at once, when Aviva asked him to give her a hypnotic command that would trigger an automatic response to her pain attacks. When the group next convened, Russell ordered everybody save Roger and Sanford out of Aviva's living room before unleashing a withering attack on Roger. In the course of the tongue-lashing, Roger was told that he was irresponsible, that he didn't have Aviva's best interests at heart, and that he was placing her life in jeopardy. Finally, he was ordered to instruct Sanford in his hypnotic technique and to hand over knowledge of the key phrase which facilitated Aviva's journey into unconsciousness. From that moment, Sanford not only proceeded to conduct healing sessions on Aviva without Roger's mediation, but he also, with Russell's blessing, gradually assumed leadership of the Friday night discussions. It was soon obvious to the group members that Sanford was able to bring Aviva out of trance with greater ease and speed than Roger had managed. On awakening, Aviva said she felt less groggy than before.
So now Roger, Aviva's neighbor who had served as the initial hypnotist for the group, was out, and newcomer Sanford had replaced him. When it comes to his own appraisal of the newcomer, Joe says,
Sanford was not a close personal friend of mine. We never engaged in heart-to-heart discussions. But seeing him every Friday night, I noticed that, although he always put on a smile, he was becoming increasingly anxious and uncommunicative, and I wondered occasionally why his life-saving mission hadn't brought him greater joy. Sometimes I also wondered about my own state of mind. I was more jittery than usual, more susceptible to insomnia and nervous tension, and, to my irritation and dismay, certain friends seemed increasingly concerned about my well-being. No matter how hard I tried, I could not shrug off a cloying sense of contamination which could neither be pinpointed nor explained. Life had rarely seemed so fraught with uneasiness.
Unfortunately, Sanford's time as Aviva's healer and the group's new hypnotist was limited.
Roger Bellencourt had regained his original position as group leader and hypnotist. Sanford Ellison, it was rumored, would not be returning to our sessions. There was talk of personal antagonism between Aviva and himself. There was even talk of Sanford's mental instability. I knew that Sanford had not been feeling well for a long time and that his marriage was under tremendous strain. Yet he was closer to the guides than anyone, and it was hard to imagine the sessions without him. Moreover, I wondered how Aviva would survive without his healing hands. Sanford's abdication of the group's leadership spoke more loudly than words of a serious rift within our family circle. Fearing involvement in a petty squabble, however, I chose not to seek out Sanford to ask why he was no longer with us. Instead, I accepted Russell's explanation. Sanford, he said, had opted for negatively and backsliding rather than forward development, and the group would be better off without him.
We're now at a period in Joe's life that covers 1985 and 1986. Despite his failure to verify Ernest's prior life as an individual, Joe had received enough confirmation of Ernest's claims, including his new incarnation as a baby, that his faith in the guides survived. In fact,
throughout 1985 and 1986, the guides were my lifeblood, my consuming passion. Every session, and particularly the rare, private sessions that I had with Philippa when alone, I hunched over the sleeping yet garrulous Aviva, was an extraordinary thrill. So honored and privileged did I feel at being granted this open communication with the next world that when I tried to express my gratitude to Philippa, tears welled up in my eyes and my voice began to quake. Largely because of Philippa's influence, I embarked upon a relationship with a Greek woman, Sylvia Prosalis, whom I met at a party one evening. Though Sylvia doubted the existence of my guide, she did teach me words and phrases in Greek so that I could make Philippa feel at home as well as test her responses. Philippa passed each of these mini tests easily and often with humor. For example, when I greeted her with Manati Mao, meaning my little lamb, she shot back, "I am not woolly."
from an evidential perspective, this would be very significant. With Sylvia's help, Joe had learned how to refer to Philippa as his little lamb in Greek, and when confronted with this phrase, without warning, Philippa gave an appropriate response. "I'm not woolly."
Disappointingly, however, on the two occasions that Sylvia visited Aviva's living room in the hope of conversing in Greek, Russell insisted on holding forward development debates to the exclusion of all else. Sylvia's skepticism intensified as a result, and I tired of trying to convince her of Philippa's presence. We soon drifted apart.
Consistent with Joe's prior history of romantic relationships, he thus concluded,
My terrestrial love life was doomed. No woman of flesh and blood could hope to emulate Philippa's love and concern. No incarnate female could ever begin to understand me in the fashion to which I had become accustomed. In a sense, I was lost to the world, living in a limbo land beyond most earthly cares and considerations. It was eternity that mattered, I told myself, not the petty concerns of unenlightened beings who are blind to our infinite potential. Still, I wanted to demonstrate that this larger vision was more than a dream. And with this aim in mind, I returned to my original mandate, to venture beyond the group to see whether there was a consensus among channeled entities at large.
Now, at this point, in the mid-1980s, channeling was a big thing. There were individuals like Jay-Z Knight and her Atlantean warrior spirit Ramtha who were all over pop culture. So there was lots of interest in channeling exotic spirits, channeling just being a form of mediumship, though sometimes with an exotic spirit like an Atlantean warrior, seeming to speak through the medium or channel. And since his mission in life was to spread knowledge of the guides, and since he needed to check out what the spirits were saying rather than just accepting them, Joe decided to do further research for his book by broadening the circle of mediums he was talking to, so that his data wouldn't just be coming through Aviva and her guides.
The channeling movement was fast expanding in North America, and there were many people in Ontario and neighboring New York State who claimed to be able to enter trance in order to bring forward guides and teachers for the education of all. As I made my plans to meet some of them, Russell's original warning resounded in my ears. The first thing you must establish is whether a guide is, in fact, a guide or a playful spirit. or not a guide at all.
So Joe thought of an ingenious plan to test this.
Would guides communicating through other mediums be able to identify Philippa, make contact with her, and impart information about our last life together to verify that the link had been made? Yes, said Philippa, if they were genuine guides. If they shrank from being tested in this way, I was advised not to trust them.
This was a good idea. If Joe had confidence that Philippa was real, it would serve to validate the abilities of other mediums if they could communicate with her as Joe's guide. Joe also got advice from Aviva's guide, Russell.
Russell felt that I should challenge other discarnates by inquiring about my occupation during my most recent Greek incarnation, and by asking to know where in Greece Philippa and I had lived. And he urged that I inquire about souls and entities. Those who did not understand the difference between the two streams of humanity would be the fakes, and who would give themselves away by revealing absurd discrepancies.
So, armed with a set of issues to ask other mediums about, Joe went forth to test other channelers. He has a whole chapter about these encounters in his book, but we won't go through it all here. Suffice it to say that the other mediums failed. They could not come up with the kind of information that would convince Joe that they were in communication with Philippa, and they weren't aware of the soul entity distinction that Russell and other guides were aware of. However, there was one medium that stood out from the others. Her name was Claire Laforgia, and she channeled an English surgeon from the 19th century named Dr. Samuel Pinkerton. And Dr. Pinkerton was able to provide some significant, beyond random chance information about Philippa, like the fact that he, Joe, and Philippa had been incarnate together around 1760, which fit their Greek incarnation. He also discerned that her name began with the letter P, like Peter, which would be true of an English spelling of her name as Philippa with a PH. Unfortunately, Dr. Pinkerton wasn't able to ultimately convince Joe that he was actually in contact with her, but Dr. Pinkerton will come back into our story later, so remember him.
With these disappointments, how was Joe proceeding with the plans for writing his book, which would help introduce the general public to what he'd been learning about the guides and their teachings for humanity?
Well, he wasn't thrilled that his investigations of other channelers weren't turning up confirmation of what he had learned from Aviva's group, but he was still actively looking into what they said. In fact, Joe was planning another verification trip to Europe, and this would be a big one. He had plans to verify the existence of 3 of the group's guides. One was Aviva's guide Russell, who had been a shepherd in 19th century England. Another was Tom's new guide, who had replaced Ernest. This was the World War I soldier Harry. And the third was his own guide, Philippa. To verify her existence, he was going to his beloved land of Greece and walk the streets that they had walked together. Through Aviva, Joe thus interviewed Philippa, gathering as much information as he'd need to verify the details of their lives together and her own existence. However, before he could leave for Europe, Joe had an unexpected encounter.
It so happened that I ran into Sanford Ellison at a house party only days before I left Toronto. He looked awful. Drawn and defeated, he exhibited all the signs of physical and emotional exhaustion. I was not inclined to spend much time in Sanford's company because Russell had left us little doubt about his regressive behavior. Besides, the party's hubbub forbade serious discussion. But one comment made during our brief chat was to remain with me all the way to Greece and back again. "Anytime you're ready to hear about the other side of the guides," Sanford said somewhat cryptically, "I'll be glad to tell you all I know."
And that's what we'll tell you next time. The other side of the spirit guides that Joe and Sanford had encountered.
Anything else you want to say before we close?
Just a reminder that I'm going to be teaching the Introduction to Parapsychology course at the Rhine Education Center this May and June. The Rhine asked me to teach their online Introduction to Parapsychology course last fall, and it was a big success. So the Rhine has asked me to teach the course again. It's an 8-week course that we'll be offering live in May and June, but you don't have to be at the lectures live. They'll be recorded, and you'll have at least 6 months to watch them at your leisure. You can either audit the course, which means, watch and listen to it just for your own information, or you could take it for a grade. And if you pass, you get a special certificate signed by me. It's a really interesting course, and I hope you'll join me. It covers fascinating material that any fan of Mysterious World would love. Furthermore, the Rhine has asked me to also teach a course on Christianity and parapsychology this August, and a course on world religions and parapsychology this fall. So by taking Introduction to Parapsychology now, you can be in a good position to get the most out of the religion-themed courses that I'll be teaching later in the year. Just go to Rhine, that's RHINEEDU.org to learn more. Once again, that's RHINEEDU.org.
And Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to folks on this episode?
We'll have a link to where you can read about my course on the Introduction to Parapsychology, and also one of Joe Fisher's books that deals with our subject today.
Very good. So now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Joe Fisher and the guides that he encountered? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our Mysterious Feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
Also want to say thank you to Rob Mady for his voiceover work on this episode. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work they did on this episode. You can check out their work by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And I am trying to grow it, and you can help by liking, commenting, and subscribing. When you like and comment, that tells YouTube you found the video engaging, and therefore other people might find it engaging. So the algorithm will show it to them too. Also, the fundamental way the channel grows is through subscribers. So please do subscribe, and be sure to hit the bell notification so that you get notified whenever I have a new video out. Usually these days there's multiple videos a week.
Excellent. So Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we'll tell you what happened after Joe went to Europe for his latest verification trip. We'll tell you what he discovered and the twists that followed, so you won't want to miss what's coming next.
Excellent. Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where you should make sure to hit the bell to get notifications. You can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/310. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.